In the darkness before dawn on December 19, 1944, 6 American sentries stood watch along a fog-choked perimeter in the Arden Forest of Belgium, each man equipped with a device their own army had banned 3 months earlier. The device was silent. It required no ammunition, and within 90 seconds of activation, it would kill 6 men without a single shot fired. The sergeant who built it knew he was breaking orders. He also knew that by morning, without it, more of his men would simply vanish into the cold. This is the story of a weapon that was never supposed to exist, a decision that saved lives precisely because it violated every rule, and a man who understood that sometimes survival requires choosing between what is permitted and what is necessary. The Arden Forest in mid-December was a place where sound died. Fog moved through the trees in layers so dense that a man could stand 10 feet from another and see only the suggestion of a shape, a darker smudge against the gray. The cold was not the cutting wind of open ground but a wet, seeping cold that worked its way through wool and canvas and settled in the bones. Snow lay in patches, old and crusted, mixed with mud that never quite froze. The forest floor was soft underfoot, muffling footsteps, absorbing noise. Even gunfire, when it came, had a strangely flat quality, as if the trees and fog conspired to contain violence within invisible boundaries. By the 3rd week of December, the Battle of the Bulge had shattered the illusion of an easy end to the war. German forces had punched through American lines in a desperate offensive, and now the Allied positions were a patchwork of hasty defenses, improvised supply lines, and units that had been thrown together without proper coordination. The 87th Infantry Division occupied a sector near the Belgian-German border, holding a line that ran through dense forest and offered excellent cover to anyone who knew how to use it. The Americans had learned, over the previous 10 days, that the forest favored the patient and the quiet. Sergeant Thomas Callaway was 34 years old, which made him ancient by infantry standards. Most of the men in his unit were barely old enough to vote. Callaway had been drafted in 1943, pulled from a civilian life that had revolved around precision work, watch repair, small engine maintenance, the kind of mechanical problem-solving that required steady hands and an intuitive understanding of how objects failed. The Army had recognized his aptitude and assigned him to ordnance, where he maintained weapons, diagnosed malfunctions, and occasionally fabricated parts when supply lines failed to deliver. He was not a combat soldier in the traditional sense. He carried a rifle, but his value lay in keeping other men's rifles functional. He was a quiet man, economical with words, and possessed of a temperament that registered problems before others noticed them. In civilian life, this had made him an excellent repairman. In war, it made him observant in ways that command structures often failed to accommodate. He saw patterns in mechanical failures. He noticed when equipment degraded in predictable sequences. And over the past week, he had noticed something else. Men were disappearing from the eastern perimeter in a pattern so precise it could not be coincidence. The first disappearance had occurred on December 12th. Private First Class Daniel Kowalski, a sentry posted at the forest's edge, had failed to report at the 4 a.m. check-in. His position was found empty. No signs of struggle. His rifle was gone, his helmet remained, and his footprints led 3 feet into the underbrush before vanishing. The assumption initially was desertion. The Battle of the Bulge had created chaos, and men under extreme stress sometimes broke. But Kowalski had been reliable, had shown no signs of instability, and the circumstances felt wrong to those who knew him. 2 nights later, it happened again. Corporal James Mitchum, stationed at a different point along the same perimeter, disappeared between 2:30 and 4 a.m. His rifle was found leaning against a tree, his cigarettes still in his pocket. No blood. No cell casings. No indication that he had fired his weapon or called for help. The platoon began to talk. Speculation ranged from enemy snipers with suppressed weapons to something more irrational. Stories that spread in whispers about forests and fog and men who walked into the trees and never returned. By December 16th, 4 men had vanished. All from the eastern perimeter. All during the pre-dawn hours. All without any audible sign of violence. Command responded with increased patrols, overlapping sentry positions, and stricter check-in protocols. None of it helped. On the night of December 17th, a fifth sentry disappeared. This time, a nearby soldier reported hearing a brief, muffled sound. Not a gunshot, not a shout, but something like fabric tearing or a heavy sack being dragged. By the time he reached the position, there was nothing to find. Callaway had been watching the pattern develop with the same methodical attention he applied to diagnosing a malfunctioning firing pin. He charted the locations on a hand-drawn map, noted the times, and cross-referenced them with weather conditions and patrol schedules. The disappearances occurred during periods of maximum fog density, when visibility dropped below 15 feet. They occurred in the narrow window between the 2 a.m. and 4 a.m. patrols, when sentries were alone and fatigued. And they occurred at positions where the forest offered multiple approach routes that could not be effectively monitored. The German infiltration technique, Callaway concluded, was not sophisticated in the sense of advanced technology. It was sophisticated in its patience and precision. The infiltrators were likely scouts, moving through the fog in small groups, targeting isolated sentries, neutralizing them silently, and extracting information about American positions, strength, and supply routes. The goal was reconnaissance, not direct engagement. The killings were incidental, necessary only because leaving sentries alive would trigger alarms. And the method had to be silent, which meant close-range work. Knives, garrotes, hands. The kind of violence that required proximity and control. Command's response, in Callaway's assessment, was inadequate. Increasing patrol frequency did not address the fundamental problem. The forest was too dense, the fog too thick, and the infiltrators too skilled at exploiting narrow windows of opportunity. More sentries simply meant more targets. Better communication protocols were irrelevant when a man could be killed in seconds without time to raise an alarm. The solution required changing the equation, making the act of approaching a sentry so immediately dangerous that infiltrators would either fail or expose themselves. Callaway had built the device 3 months earlier, in October, during a period of relative calm near the French border. The concept was simple. A pressure-sensitive trigger mounted inside a combat boot, connected by a thin cable to a spring-loaded blade mechanism strapped to the shin. When an attacker grabbed a sentry from behind, the standard method for silent neutralization, the sentry's instinctive response was to shift weight backward, pushing down on the heel. That pressure would release the spring, and the blade would deploy forward and upward, traveling approximately 8 inches in less than 1/10 of a second, striking whatever was directly in front of the shin. The design had been inspired by a hunting trap Callaway had seen as a boy in rural Pennsylvania, a simple spring mechanism that relied on tension and release rather than complex engineering. The blade was a modified bayonet, sharpened to a narrow point and mounted on a steel rail that guided its trajectory. The spring was salvaged from a truck suspension system, providing enough force to drive the blade through clothing and tissue without requiring perfect aim. The entire apparatus weighed less than 2 pounds and could be strapped on and removed in under a minute. He had presented the device to his commanding officer in October, along with a written explanation of its function and tactical application. The response had been swift and unequivocal. The device was not authorized for use, violated regulations regarding unauthorized modifications to personal equipment, and posed unacceptable risks to friendly forces. There were concerns about accidental deployment, about soldiers injuring themselves during routine movements, about the legal and ethical implications of a weapon that operated without conscious decision-making at the moment of use. The device was confiscated, and Callaway received a written reprimand that stopped just short of formal disciplinary action. But Callaway had built 3 additional units before the confiscation, and he had kept them hidden in his repair kit, wrapped in oilcloth and buried under spare parts. He had known, even then, that circumstances might arise where doctrine and reality would diverge. He was not a man inclined toward insubordination, but he was a man who understood that systems designed in safety sometimes failed catastrophically when applied to chaos. On the evening of December 18th, after the 5th sentry disappeared, Callaway made his decision. He did not consult with command. He did not seek permission or attempt to argue his case a second time. He simply calculated risk against certainty, the certainty that more men would die if the pattern continued, versus the risk that his solution might fail or create unforeseen consequences. The calculation was not difficult. Men were dying. He had a tool that might prevent it. The rules that prohibited its use had been written by people who were not standing in the Arden Forest watching soldiers vanish into fog. He worked through the night of December 18th, moving quietly between positions along the eastern perimeter. He had identified 6 sentries whose positions matched the pattern of previous disappearances, isolated posts with poor visibility and multiple approach vectors. He did not tell the sentries what he was doing. He simply approached each man during the brief rotation periods when they were not actively on watch, told them he was inspecting their equipment, and strapped the device to their right leg. The blade housing was cold against their shins, the cable thin enough to be barely perceptible under their trousers. He explained the mechanism in precise, unemotional terms. If grabbed from behind, shift weight to the right heel. The device would activate automatically. Do not attempt to activate it manually. Do not remove it. Do not discuss it. The sentries, exhausted and frightened by the disappearances, asked few questions. They understood, in the way soldiers understand when someone offers a solution to a problem that is killing them, that this was not a moment for debate. They nodded, adjusted the straps, and returned to their positions. Callaway positioned himself at a central point where he could observe 3 of the 6 sentries, though observation in the fog meant listening more than watching. He sat with his back against a tree, rifle across his lap, and waited. The forest was silent in the way that forests are silent at 3 a.m. in winter, not an absence of sound, but a texture of sound so uniform that individual noises became impossible to distinguish. Water dripped from branches. Snow shifted and settled. Somewhere distant, an artillery piece fired, the sound reaching him as a low rumble that the fog absorbed and diffused. At 4:23 a.m., the silence changed. The sound was not loud. It was a series of brief, sharp exhalations, followed by something that might have been a gasp or a cough, followed by a wet, heavy sound like a sack of grain dropped onto soft ground. Callaway was moving before the sound finished, his rifle up, his eyes straining against the fog. He reached the first sentry position within 30 seconds. The sentry was standing, breathing hard, his right leg extended forward at an awkward angle. At his feet, barely visible in the pre-dawn darkness, was a body. The German infiltrator had approached from the east, moving through the fog with the careful, patient silence of someone trained for exactly this work. He had reached the sentry from behind, had begun the grab, one hand over the mouth, the other reaching for the knife at his belt, and the sentry had done exactly what Callaway had instructed. The shift of weight had been instinctive, a flinch more than a deliberate action, but it had been enough. The blade had deployed, traveling upward at an angle that intersected with the infiltrator's torso just below the ribcage. The German had died quickly, silently, without time to cry out or fire a weapon. Callaway moved to the second position. Another body, another sentry standing in shock. The pattern repeated at 4 more positions across the eastern perimeter. 6 infiltrators, 6 activations, 6 bodies cooling in the mud. The entire sequence had taken less than 90 seconds from first contact to final neutralization. No gunfire. No alarms. No American casualties. One of the German soldiers was still alive when Callaway reached him, though barely. He was young, perhaps 20, with the kind of pale, thin face that suggested inadequate rations and long marches. He had been struck in the lower chest, and the blade had nicked something vital. Callaway knelt beside him, checked for weapons, found none within reach. The German's eyes were open, conscious but fading. He spoke in German, a few words that Callaway did not understand, then a few words in broken English. Reconnaissance. 5 teams. Mapping positions. Another push coming. He died before he could say more, and Callaway remained kneeling beside him for a moment longer than strictly necessary, looking at the young man's face and thinking about the mechanics of what had just occurred. The device had functioned exactly as designed. It had saved lives. It had also killed 6 men in a manner that skirted every established protocol for engagement, rules of warfare, and acceptable use of force. The infiltrators had been enemy combatants engaged in hostile action, but they had been killed by a mechanism that operated without direct human decision at the moment of lethal force. The distinction mattered, legally and ethically, even if it did not matter practically. By 5 a.m., the bodies had been recovered, the sentries had been debriefed, and Callaway had been summoned to the command post. The interview was brief and cold. His commanding officer, a major who had rotated into the position 2 weeks earlier and had no personal familiarity with Callaway's record, listened to the explanation with the kind of controlled anger that comes from being presented with a situation that is simultaneously successful and insubordinate. Callaway described the device, the rationale, the deployment, and the outcome. He did not apologize. He did not justify. He presented the facts in the same tone he would use to describe a malfunctioning rifle, mechanically, precisely, without emotional coloring. The major asked whether Callaway understood that he had violated direct orders. Callaway confirmed that he understood. The major asked whether Callaway believed he had the authority to make independent tactical decisions that overrode established command structure. Callaway stated that he did not, but that he had assessed the risk and determined that action was necessary. The major informed Callaway that he would be receiving both a commendation and a formal reprimand. The commendation would recognize that his actions had prevented further casualties and had neutralized an active enemy reconnaissance operation. The reprimand would document that he had violated regulations, deployed unauthorized equipment, and acted without command approval. Both documents would be placed in his service record, and the matter would be reviewed at a higher level. In the interim, all remaining devices were to be surrendered immediately. Callaway handed over the 3 remaining units. They were placed in a canvas bag, tagged, and sent up the chain of command. He never saw them again. The German intelligence obtained from the brief interrogation proved accurate. A coordinated reconnaissance operation had been underway, targeting weak points in the American line in preparation for a secondary offensive. The neutralization of the 6 infiltrators disrupted that operation and provided warning that allowed the division to reinforce vulnerable positions. Whether this directly prevented American casualties was impossible to quantify, but the intelligence officers concluded that it had likely degraded German planning and delayed subsequent attacks. The devices themselves disappeared into the bureaucratic machinery of military analysis. According to later reports that Callaway never personally saw but heard about through indirect channels, the units were examined by ordnance specialists, documented in classified technical reports, and eventually archived. The design was deemed mechanically sound but operationally unacceptable for general deployment due to safety concerns, legal ambiguity, and incompatibility with established doctrine. The incident was noted, analyzed, and filed. It did not appear in training manuals. It did not influence official policy. It became, in the language of institutional memory, an anomaly. Callaway received no further disciplinary action. The commendation and reprimand remained in his file, contradictory notations that suggested an event too complicated to resolve cleanly. He continued his work as an ordnance technician through the remainder of the war, maintaining weapons, repairing equipment, and solving mechanical problems. He did not build additional devices. He did not discuss the incident except when directly questioned, and those questions became less frequent as personnel rotated and the event receded into the noise of wartime operations. The war in Europe ended in May 1945. Callaway was discharged in August and returned to Pennsylvania, where he resumed work as a precision repairman. He opened a small shop that specialized in watches, clocks, and small engines. He married in 1947, had 2 children, and lived a life that was quiet, orderly, and bore no obvious marks of the things he had seen or done during the war. He did not attend veteran reunions. He did not speak publicly about his service. When asked about the war, he offered brief, factual responses that discouraged follow-up questions. He died in 1982, at the age of 72 of heart failure. His obituary in the local newspaper noted his military service but provided no details. His children, sorting through his possessions, found a small wooden box that contained his discharge papers, a commendation certificate, and a formal reprimand dated December 1944. The commendation cited actions that prevented casualties and neutralized enemy forces. The reprimand cited violation of equipment regulations. Neither document explained the specifics. His children read both, found them confusing, and filed them with other family papers. The device itself, or rather the concept embedded in its design, appeared again decades later in fragmented form. Special operations units in subsequent conflicts experimented with pressure-sensitive defensive mechanisms, though none replicated Callaway's exact design. The principle, immediate, automatic response to hostile contact without requiring conscious decision-making, influenced thinking about close-quarters defensive tools, even if no formal lineage could be traced. Innovation in military equipment often occurs through unofficial channels, through soldiers solving immediate problems with available materials, and the solutions sometimes echo forward even when their origins are lost. What is documented in after-action reports and casualty records is that the pattern of sentry disappearances along the eastern perimeter ceased on the morning of December 19, 1944. No further infiltrations occurred in that sector for the remainder of the division's deployment. Whether this was due to the disruption of German reconnaissance operations, a shift in enemy tactics, or simply chance is impossible to determine with certainty. What is certain is that the 6 sentries who wore Callaway's devices on the night of December 18 survived the war. All 6 returned home. None of them were ever asked to explain publicly what had happened in the fog that morning, and none of them volunteered the information. The Arden Forest is still there, though the war has long since moved through it and left it changed. The trees have grown back where they were shattered. The mud has settled and frozen and thawed through 70 winters. The positions where sentries stood are unmarked, indistinguishable from the rest of the forest floor. There is nothing to indicate that 6 men died there in 90 seconds, silently, killed by a mechanism that was never supposed to exist. Systems are designed to prevent chaos, to impose order on violence, to ensure that decisions are made through proper channels with appropriate oversight. This is necessary. Wars cannot be fought by individuals acting independently, each applying their own judgment to circumstances that require coordination and unified command. Doctrine exists because improvisation at scale creates more problems than it solves. But systems are also abstractions, rules written in safety and applied to danger, and there are moments when the gap between doctrine and reality becomes unsurvivable. In those moments, someone must choose. The choice is rarely clean. It involves breaking rules that exist for good reasons, accepting risks that cannot be fully calculated, and acting without the permission or understanding of those who designed the system. Callaway's device was never officially sanctioned because it raised questions that military institutions could not answer cleanly. It operated in the space between self-defense and preemptive force. It removed human judgment from the moment of lethal action, replacing it with mechanical response. It was simple, effective, and incompatible with the frameworks that govern legitimate warfare. The fact that it saved lives did not make it acceptable. The fact that it was unacceptable did not make it wrong. What remains is a question without a satisfying answer. Whether there is a place within systems designed for order, for individuals who see patterns that the system cannot accommodate and who choose action over compliance when lives are the cost of waiting. Callaway made that choice. 6 men lived because of it. The device that saved them was confiscated, studied, and buried in archives. The incident was noted and filed. The pattern it broke never resumed. In the end, what Callaway built was not remembered because it was never allowed to be. It existed in the space between what is permitted and what is necessary, and it functioned there precisely because it was never brought into the light. Some solutions work only in the dark, only in the moment before doctrine can arrive to prohibit them, only when someone is willing to accept that saving lives and following orders are not always the same thing. The sentries who wore the device that night are mostly gone now, claimed by time rather than war. A few may still remain, old men with grandchildren, living quiet lives that might have ended in a Belgian forest if a sergeant they barely knew had not chosen to break the rules. They might remember the cold, the fog, the weight of something strapped to their shin that they did not fully understand. They might remember the moment when that weight became motion, when instinct became violence, when something they had not chosen to activate saved their lives without their permission. Or they might not remember at all. Memory is selective, particularly when it touches on things too complicated to explain. What matters is not what they remember, but what did not happen. The alarms that did not sound. The bodies that were not found. The letters that were not written to families explaining that their sons had vanished in the night, without gunfire, without trace, into fog that gave up no answers. Callaway understood this, though he never spoke of it in these terms. He was a man who fixed things, who looked at broken mechanisms and understood what had failed and how to prevent the failure from recurring. The problem he solved on December 18, 1944, was not mechanical. It was the gap between what systems permit and what survival requires. He built a device that closed that gap for 90 seconds, and then he surrendered it to the system that had prohibited it, because he understood that his role was not to change doctrine but to ensure that men lived long enough for doctrine to matter. The device is gone. The records are filed. The forest is silent. What remains is the fact that 6 men did not die, and the certainty that the reason they did not die will never appear in any manual, any training program, any official history of how wars are fought and won. Some solutions save lives precisely because they never become official, because they exist only in the moment when someone who understands the cost of an action chooses to act anyway, knowing that the rules he breaks are the same rules that will judge him afterward. This is not a story about heroism. Callaway was not a hero in the way that word is usually understood. He was a technician who saw a problem, built a solution, and deployed it when the cost of waiting became unacceptable. He broke orders. He violated regulations. He acted without authority. And because of that, 6 men lived. The question that remains, 70 years later, is whether we understand what that means. Whether we can hold, simultaneously, the necessity of order and the recognition that order sometimes demands actions it cannot permit. Whether we can acknowledge that the men who make those choices are neither heroes to be celebrated nor criminals to be punished, but something more complicated, individuals who accept the burden of acting in the space between what is allowed and what is required, knowing that the system they serve will never be able to thank them or forgive them cleanly. Callaway never sought recognition. He returned to his workshop, repaired watches, raised his children, and lived his life in the kind of quiet obscurity that suggests a man at peace with choices that others might struggle to justify. He built a device that saved 6 lives and broke every rule to do it. The device was taken from him, studied, and filed away. The lives continued. The rules remained. And somewhere in the archives of military history, there is a note about an incident in December 1944, an unauthorized deployment, a successful outcome, and a sergeant who understood that sometimes the most important things a person does are the things that will never be remembered. If you found this story worth your time, consider subscribing to the channel. These histories deserve to be told, and your support makes that possible. Leave a like if this resonated with you, and I'll leave you with a question to consider. When the rules that are meant to protect us prevent us from surviving, who decides when it's time to break them? And what do we owe to the people who make that decision for us, knowing they'll never be thanked for it? Think about it, and I'll see you in the next one.